Well, I would like to start with thanking Tovik and the organizing team for taking this meeting here to Toronto. It's amazing to be here, and it feels like a family reunion. And today I would like to talk about our cellular, but also not so cellular insights into human intelligence. So I probably don't have to convince this audience that our intelligence is extremely important to us. We spend, so this world it becomes increasingly complex, and to navigate this complexity, we need high cognitive skills. So we spend a lot of effort and decades of our life in education developing these cognitive abilities. And but despite this effort, large differences in intelligence still remain between individuals. And we know that these differences are meaningful. So if we look at statistics, intelligence is a best predictor for education and career. So people with high intelligence have better education career, they have higher income, they have even better health and longevity, but also high intelligence can be a protective factor against cognitive decline. So in our lab, we are interested in this fascinating question: what is the neurobiological basis of human intelligence? So what makes some brains smarter than others? And this question is not only an interesting scientific question, but I think it's also a question that is relevant, clinically relevant, because if we know what is the origin of human intelligence and differences in intelligence, we can also better understand what goes wrong in diseases of cognition and in cognitive decline in aging. So of course, our brain functions on different levels of brain organization. And in our lab, we have this ambition to bring these levels together and see how they interact to give rise to intelligence. So of course, if we want to study intelligence on all those different levels, we need access to at least human neurons. And as many of you, we work with tumor and epilepsy tissue, so resected tissue from neurosurgery. But early on, we started to collect this multi-scale data set. And this starts already before the surgery, so 2 or 1 week before the surgery, when the patients undergo extensive cognitive testing. So they also undergo extensive IQ tests. And these tests test different cognitive domains, and together will give one readout, one number for general intelligence. And I actually wanted to give you some examples of those IQ tests and test your intelligence, but decided that after yesterday's drinks, maybe not such a good idea. So we get those IQ tests, but also we get the presurgical data. Presurgical data on brain function and structure, whole brain function and structure, such as EEG, MEG, and MRI. And then, of course, we get the cortical samples, so we can analyze the cortical structure of these samples and analyze neuronal structure. And finally, we also perform single-cell physiology for neuronal function. So in this way, we can combine all these different levels and address the question, how do they interact and support human intelligence? So I want to start with just a couple of highlights of our previous work, of what we've done before, and then I will move on to some new data. So when we started, we focused on cortical organization. And the reason for that is that there is multiple studies, brain imaging studies of intelligence that show that there are areas that correlate in their cortical thickness or activity with intelligence. So, and one of those areas is middle temporal gyrus. And of course, as you know, this is the most commonly resected area, and also area that we consistently get from our patients in the lab. So we first asked whether also in our smaller sample of patients, we can see the same results as were observed in those hundreds healthy participants. So can we see the relationship between cortical thickness and intelligence? So for this, we analyzed MRI scans, but also histological stainings of the tissue. And we indeed found that cortical thickness correlated with intelligence, but those correlations were mostly due to layer 2-3 correlations. So subjects with high IQ scores had thicker cortical layers 2-3, and other layers remained similar. So of course these layers are layers that contain large range projecting neurons that will integrate information from extended association areas in the human cortex. So next we asked, do also these layer 3 neurons differ in structure if we compare people with different IQ scores? So we performed, we reconstructed full morphologies of these neurons from many patients, and we find indeed that there are differences in structure. So people with high IQ scores have neurons with more dendrites, so longer dendrites, but also these dendrites are more complex. And of course, these extended dendrites physically give more space for connectivity. So it would also mean that in the living brain, these neurons are probably constantly bombarded by incoming synaptic inputs. And they have to temporarily resolve those inputs. So, and we know from computational studies that a critical requirement for fast information processing in the network is the fast action potentials. So we analyzed the waveforms of action potentials, again, from many cells from different patients. So you can see here the averages per patient of the data. And here again, we find that these large neurons also had faster rise speeds of action potentials, faster upstrokes. And they were also able to maintain these faster upstrokes while in high-frequency firing. So these previous results show that that subjects with high IQ scores have different cortical organizations. So they have thicker cortical layers 2-3 that contain larger neurons with longer dendrites and fast action potentials. So meaning that these neurons are probably better integrators of information, of all this synaptic information. But of course, here we only scratch the surface of what is the neurobiology of intelligence. And most interesting is to look at the functional level, so the functional level of the neurons, but also function of the networks. So next, we wanted to address this: how does the cellular function relate to network function and supports intelligence? And one of the dominant hypotheses in the field of intelligence is the neural efficiency hypothesis. So this hypothesis is based on the seminal work from Richard Heyer in the 80s, who studied how people with different IQs, or with different cognitive levels, what is their brain activation during performance of cognitive tasks. And what he found is that people who perform better usually have low activation. So in PET scans, they have low glucose metabolic rate. So meaning that their brains probably function more efficiently. And of course, this whole brain activation comes about from network activation, circuit activation, and single cell. So we wanted to know how those functional levels interact with each other. And of course, I don't have to tell you this, that networks, human networks consist of pyramidal neurons and inhibitory neurons that function at this intricate balance of excitation and inhibition. And there is increasing evidence that there are shifts in excitation towards hyperexcitation that lead to cognitive dysfunction. And such shifts to hyperexcitation were observed in Alzheimer's disease, but also in tumors and lesions. So we were wondering whether in people with low IQ scores, we would also see similar shifts towards more excitation in the network. So in the cellular network, but also in the whole brain network. So we had asked this question: how does cellular network excitability relate to intelligence? And this is the work that was done by Miranda Moore, who is also here, and she has her poster hanging there on this work. So measuring cellular excitability is quite straightforward. So we all know that we can measure activity in the pyramidal neurons and measure how they respond to inputs, how much currents they would need to fire action potential or their input resistance. But we can also measure this excitation and inhibition ratios in the network. And one way to do this is to measure resting state MEG and EEG recordings. This activity in the resting state is usually dominated by alpha frequency oscillations, so in the range of 8 to 16 hertz. And the envelope of those oscillations that is shown here in red is closely linked to inhibition and excitation in the dendrites of pyramidal cells. So it is possible to extract the measure of excitation-inhibition ratio from those signals. And at our institute, there is a group of Klaus Linkerkar Hansen who developed a method to extract this functional EI balance from such resting state EEG or MEG recordings. So we wanted to use this method to ask whether we can also observe shifts in network excitability in patients with different IQ scores. So for this, Miranda collected and analyzed MEG recordings from 26 surgery patients. She also analyzed stereo EEGs. So these are electrodes that are implanted deep in the brain, usually in the temporal lobe. And Miranda focused on middle temporal gyrus, so the area where we received the tissue. And then she analyzed the data for the hemisphere where MTG was resected, but also the control hemisphere. And of course, these recordings were done before the surgery. And then we extracted alpha frequency signal and calculated functional EI balance. And here you can see the data. So each line represents one patient, so left and right hemispheric recordings. And what you see that there is a relationship between functional EI balance and IQ scores. So that in subjects with high IQ scores, the network has lower excitation inhibition ratio, meaning that there is a shift towards more inhibition in the network, while in low IQ subjects we have this more excitation in the network. And of course, you might ask, these recordings come from epilepsy patients or tumor patients that also sometimes suffer from epileptic seizures. So excitation inhibition balance should be probably not completely in a healthy state. So for this, we had this important control to also look at correlations between FEI and age of the patients, but also age of disease onset, so how old the patient was when they got epilepsy, but also years of epilepsy, so how long the patient disease and how many monthly seizures. And we don't find any correlations there. So this network activity originates from cellular activity. So next we wanted to see whether we see similar shifts in excitability on the cellular level. And for this, Miranda analyzed single-cell recordings from pyramidal neurons, and she extracted rheobase, so the amount of current that is needed to fire action potentials in these cells, and looked how the rheobase relates to intelligence. And so the higher the rheobase, the lower excitability. And what we find when we again analyze a lot of cells from different patients, and our mixed effects models show that there is this positive relationship, so that low IQ, so high IQ patients have low excitability in their cells. And similar results we find for input resistance, another measure of excitability. So here, low input resistance means low excitability and is related to high IQ scores. So these two measures are basic membrane properties, and they are very much dependent on the cell size. And we knew already from our previous research that bigger cells relate with IQ. So it kind of confirms our previous findings that this low excitability usually goes together with the size of dendrites, and we find in a larger sample of data similar results. But then we looked at also more active properties at action potential thresholds. And here we find something counterintuitive. We find the inverse relationship. So subjects with high IQ scores have a lower action potential threshold. So in a way, the neurons are more excitable. And yesterday, Kari was giving a talk and showed nicely that lower action potential thresholds actually also helps neurons to react faster and more precise to incoming signals. So what we think is that these neurons might be a better signal-to-noise decoders. So when there is noise or a lot of activity in the network, their low excitability helps them to keep the signals down, not to react. But those lower threshold action potentials and also faster rise speeds of action potentials help them to react faster when the signal is important. So these results were all correlations, and we are of course interested in also mechanistic understanding of how how cell excitability leads to computational advantage. So here we moved to computational approach to test how these cells react to ongoing activity in the network, and we used a model from Itai Hay. And as a basis, and we used evolutionary optimization to fit this model to parameters from high IQ cells and low IQ cells. So for Rio-based AP threshold and for input resistance. So we had those two models representing high IQ and low IQ cells. And then we wanted to test how they react to ongoing activity in alpha range. So the activity that we measure in resting state networks. And for this, we injected alpha currents, so alpha sinusoids and alpha frequency with some noise so that the cell will fire action potentials, and measured how these cells were timing their output to these ongoing oscillations. You can see that they actually both do a good job. They can detect these peaks in alpha frequencies, but low IQ cells fire on average much more. So, of course, if we average this activity in one cycle of ongoing oscillation, we can see it more clearly. So there is higher average activity in low IQ cells, but the peak of tuning of the activity is sharper in the high IQ cells. So although these high IQ cells fire less, they fire more precisely. And this is the case for different signal amplitudes. So if we increase the sine amplitude or decrease it, we consistently see this difference between these two models. And another way to look at this ongoing, phase locking to ongoing activities, to look at the timings of these action potentials, to calculate all the timings. So here you can see the same data, but then in a circular plot, so from 0 to trough of the oscillation, P and peak of the oscillation, and you can see all those dots representing action potentials. And again, low IQ cell fires everywhere, but if we look at the timings of the firing to a peak of the oscillation, the vector strength is higher in high IQ cells. So these cells are timing more precisely their action potential firing to ongoing oscillations. And again, it's the case for different signal amplitudes. So I came to the end of my story, and I would like to summarize what I've been talking about. So if we look at this distribution of IQ scores in the population of our patients, what we find in high IQ score patients is that they have a different cortical organization. So their cortex is thicker, and especially layer 2-3. So these layers contain neurons with larger Dendrites, more complex dendrites, the neuronal function of these cells is also different. They fire fast action potentials, but have low excitability and lower firing thresholds. And this translates into low excitation in the resting state network activity. And finally, it gives these neurons a computational advantage. So they are more efficient, coming back to efficient hypothesis. So they are more efficient signal-to-noise detectors because they fire fewer spikes, but more precisely. And I want to emphasize that here we are looking at this phenotype of like high and low intelligence, but it's also very much similar to what we observe in diseases of cognition. So for example, cortical thinning or a high excitation in the network activity is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. And here we can look at more cellular features that can underlie those defects. So in the end, I want to thank everyone who contributed to this work. Of course, Miranda Moore for all her effort, and also Thijs Verhoog, because we are still using your cells, Thijs, for our models and for our results. And with this, I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very exciting. I hope not too exciting, but go ahead. You have a first question.
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely terrific. I have two questions. The first one is, to which degree can the changes in excitability be explained by changes in morphology and otherwise changes perhaps in ion channel distribution? And my second question would be, do you think you can leverage this approach also to inspect GABAergic cells, and what would you expect?
Yeah, great question. So yes, as I mentioned, excitability of course goes together also with changes with scaling of morphologies. So we would expect low excitability in the bigger cells, but not everything depends on the cell size. So for example, action potential threshold and to some extent also upstrokes are not completely dependent on the morphology. Concerning interneurons, that would be really amazing to study interneurons. We haven't done this because, again, it would take another 10 years, especially with all the types of interneurons. But that would be very interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is over here. Many questions. We don't have time to have them all, so sorry about that. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I might have missed this, but I was wondering if you also looked at not just IQ, you could compared some of your data to age as well. But if you looked at temporal lobe epilepsy as in the context of with hippocampal sclerosis, without hippocampal sclerosis, and then ILAE grades as well, because we know with hippocampal sclerosis there's a thinning of the cortical matter as well. I wonder if that might be underlying some of the data as well.
Yeah, so we of course looked at the relationship between IQ and age. We don't find that relationship, but it's also logical that we don't find it because IQ tests are usually corrected for age. And no, we didn't take into account hippocampal sclerosis in this data. But yeah, maybe worth looking into this. Yes.
We take two more questions. Kari first, and then Kostas.
Wow. One question that in those pyramidal cells from high IQ people, have you looked at whether they are more higher fidelity action potential generators? What I mean by this is that you found that they have a lower firing threshold, but if you applied like a sinusoidal oscillation, so it's like a mimicking gamma, like excitatory inhibitory cycle in those cells, would you be able to reproduce a kind of more precise, more sharply phase-locked firing in those cells, which gives less, variability in cycle by cycle? In other ways, are they able to encode information with less jitter and noise?
Well, that's something that we already show here, right? This less jitter encoding information with less jitter in alpha frequency. But of course, this is only the beginning, so our next step is to combine also this alpha frequency with gamma frequency oscillation and to look how these neurons can challenge them a bit more and to look how they can detect both alpha and gamma oscillations coinciding. Yeah, if that answers your question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah, great work. I had a question, follow up to the first question about, morphologies and how those affect everything. So you did say that you used Itai's model or changed it. So to basically fit it to low and high IQ. So in this particular case, you would have basically a rat layer 5 model, right? That used the same morphology, right, under the two conditions. So everything else, morphologies are equal at that point. So I wonder, did you run a pairwise comparison of the conductances to see what changes in the conductances you ran up to, evolutionary optimization, those conductances, some of them should be different in terms of the setup.
Right.
So what came out of that?
Yeah, so first of all, we use a human neural model with the realistic morphology, but the morphology is the same for the two models because we were interested in only physiological properties. And then in terms of conductances, we first generated models that only reproduced excitability differences, so input resistance and Rio base. But of course, for action potential threshold, that's a more complicated story. So if we want to also to have changes in action potential threshold, we had to loosen the parameters for no. But thanks for that suggestion. We will.
Great. With that, thank you very much, Natalia. And